The new beginning. Jane Harper sat in the passenger seat of her family's old minivan, fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her worn-out jacket sleeve. Her eyes, a soft hazel flecked with shades of green, were locked onto the world outside the window. But her mind was far from the passing scenery. It was her first day at Westfield Middle School, a new beginning for her, and yet it felt like the heaviest day of her young life. Her mother, Rebecca, was driving, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if trying to keep everything together, even though Jane could sense her anxiety. In the back seat, her father, Louis, kept quiet, glancing occasionally at his daughter in the rearview mirror. His expression was unreadable, but Jane could see the lines of worry around his eyes. They were all silently bracing for what the day would bring. The constant reminder of the eye patch that covered Jane's left eye weighed heavily on her heart. It had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember, ever since the accident back in Thailand when she was just a little girl. The doctors had told her parents that her sight couldn't be saved, but Jane had learned to adapt. She had learned how to be strong, how to navigate the world with one eye, and yet every time she looked in the mirror, she couldn't help but see the difference that set her apart from everyone else. And it wasn't just the eye patch that made her feel different. No, it was the years of being made to feel like an outsider. The cruel whispers behind her back, the stares that lingered longer than they should. It wasn't just the kids who were unkind. It was the adults too. Teachers who treated her like a problem, classmates who avoided her, and the feeling of isolation that was a constant companion. Her thoughts drifted back to the last two schools. Her first school in the States, where she had tried so hard to fit in, only to be met with judgment and exclusion. And then the second school, where she had tried again, but the results had been the same. Jane had given up hope of ever being accepted, of ever finding a place where she felt like she truly belonged. "I just don't want to go," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "What if they make fun of me, Mom?" Rebecca, always the calm one in the family, took a deep breath and turned slightly in her seat to meet Jane's eyes. "Sweetheart, I know it's scary," she said softly, "but you've always been strong, and you're stronger than you think. Today is a new day, a fresh start. You don't know what's waiting for you there, but I promise you, it won't be like the others. You'll see." "But what if they think I'm weird?" Jane's voice cracked, betraying the vulnerability she felt deep inside. "What if I'm never going to fit in?" Rebecca reached over and placed a hand on Jane's, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You're not weird. January, you're unique. And trust me, the right people will see you for who you truly are." Louis, who had been quiet up until this point, spoke up, his voice steady but filled with concern. "We've been through a lot, honey," he said, his eyes meeting Jane's in the rearview mirror. "You've been through a lot, but this is a new chapter. And no matter what happens, we'll be here, every step of the way." Jane wanted so badly to believe her parents. They had promised her that this time it would be different. But how could she trust that? How could she believe that people would see her beyond the eye patch, beyond the thing that made her different? Every time she had tried before, she had been disappointed. "Maybe things will be better here," Louis added, trying to offer a bit of optimism. "Your mom's right. Every new school brings new possibilities. And hey, even if it's tough at first, you'll make it through. You're tougher than you think." Jane nodded, but the anxiety in her chest didn't dissipate. She tried to remind herself of the good things, the moments when she had been happy, when she felt like she truly belonged. But even those memories seemed like distant dreams, out of reach now. They reached the entrance to Westfield Middle School, and Jane's heart skipped a beat. The school loomed large before her, a sea of students streaming through the front doors, talking and laughing in groups. It looked like a place filled with energy, but to Jane, it felt like a battlefield. Her mother's voice broke through the noise in Jane's head. "We'll be right here. If anything happens, if you need us, we're just a phone call away." Jane tried to muster a smile as she glanced over at her parents, but it was weak, lacking the confidence she so desperately wanted to project. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door of the van and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked toward the school entrance, trying to hold her head high, to act like she wasn't terrified. But inside, she felt small and insignificant. She wasn't sure if she could make it through this day. Not after everything that had happened before. As Jane entered the school, she was immediately hit by the noise. The laughter, the chatter, the sound of lockers opening and closing. It all felt like too much, like the walls were closing in on her. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure, and walked to her first class with slow, measured steps. She could feel eyes on her, could sense the stares and whispers, but she refused to look up. The bell rang, signaling the start of the day, and Jane found her seat in the classroom. She tried to ignore the whispering behind her, the glances from the other students who were clearly sizing her up. The teacher, Mrs. Roselle, stood at the front of the class, calling out names for introductions. Jane Harper. Mrs. Roselle called, her tone flat. Jane raised her hand, her heart hammering in her chest. She stood up and gave a quick, nervous smile to the class, her hand instinctively reaching up to adjust her eye patch. "Hi, I'm Jane," she said softly. "I just moved here from Thailand." There was a brief silence, and then the snickers started. Jane's face burned with embarrassment, but she tried to ignore them, to focus on the words coming from the teacher. But Mrs. Roselle, in her attempt to lighten the mood, made a joke. "Well, Jane," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "looks like we have a pirate in the class." The class erupted in laughter, and Jane's stomach twisted into knots. She wished she could disappear. The sound of their laughter was deafening. It was the same thing that had happened in every school before. She had tried to be brave, tried to laugh along, but the words stung. She tried to hold it together, but it wasn't easy. The day was just beginning, and already it felt like too much. But Jane had no idea that later that evening, everything would change. That the knock on her door would lead to a moment of hope, one that would spark a transformation she never saw coming. The unexpected encounter. By the time the lunch bell rang, Jane was already counting down the minutes until she could retreat back to the safety of her room. The morning had been filled with quiet taunts, the kind that didn't always need words. Just the subtle glances, the long stares that made her skin crawl. Mrs. Roselle had attempted to salvage the mood with a few more quips, but each comment felt like a reminder of how different Jane was, how much she stood out in a place where fitting in was the ultimate goal. At lunch, Jane found herself at a table in the far corner of the cafeteria. The sound of laughter and clinking trays swirling around her, but she was too far from the noise to be a part of it. She picked at her food absent-mindedly, her mind drifting back to her old schools, to the broken promises of change that had always ended in disappointment. She could feel the familiar weight of loneliness settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. It was easier to sit in silence than to try and break into a conversation with kids who seemed to already have their tight-knit circles. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor caught her attention, and before she could stop herself, she turned her head to see a figure standing beside her table. "Is this seat taken?" The voice was soft, yet firm, and had a sense of quiet confidence to it that made Jane look up in surprise. The girl standing there was tall for her age, with short, curly hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to hold a glimmer of something. Understanding. She wore a bright red hoodie, the kind that felt almost out of place in a sea of drab cafeteria uniforms and generic school colors. Jane blinked, unsure of what to say. She was used to people sitting elsewhere, avoiding her like the plague. She had learned early on not to expect kindness from strangers. But this girl, she wasn't looking at her with pity or curiosity, or any of the usual expressions that made Jane feel like a specimen under a microscope. She was simply waiting for an answer, as though this was the most normal question in the world. "No," Jane said, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. "I mean, it's not taken." The girl smiled, The kind of smile that didn't seem forced, didn't seem like it was trying to mask anything. It was genuine, as though she really wanted to be there. She pulled out the chair and sat down with a small thud, placing her lunch tray down beside her. "I'm Emma," she said, offering her hand with a casual confidence that Jane wasn't quite used to. "I saw you sitting here alone. And, well, I thought I'd come keep you company. Is that okay?" Jane hesitated, her mind racing with uncertainty. Why would she want to sit with me? She thought. But something in Emma's demeanor made it hard to turn her away. She wasn't trying to make Jane feel small or awkward. She wasn't laughing at her or pretending she didn't exist. She was just there. "Sure," Jane finally said, extending her hand cautiously. "I'm Jane." For a moment, the two girls just sat there, neither speaking. Yet somehow, there was no discomfort in the silence. Emma began to unpack her lunch, offering Jane a half smile as she opened a container filled with a homemade sandwich and some fruit. "You're new, right?" Emma asked after a moment, breaking the quiet. Her voice was steady, like she was simply making an observation. "Yeah," Jane replied, trying to sound casual. "I just moved here." "That's tough," Emma said sympathetically, her gaze meeting Jane's. "I know what it's like. I've been to a few schools too. You'd think people would know how to be nice, but they don't always get it." There was something in her voice that made Jane feel like Emma really understood, like she had been through things that weren't visible on the surface. "Yeah," Jane said quietly, the words catching in her throat. It wasn't that she didn't want to open up, but the thought of speaking about her struggles was always so difficult. She didn't know if she could explain how much the loneliness weighed on her or how heavy the feeling of being different had become. Emma seemed to sense this. She smiled again, her brown eyes twinkling with something that felt like reassurance. "I get it. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. But if you ever do, I'm a good listener." Jane gave a small, grateful smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes fully but hinted at the relief she felt in that moment. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The two girls continued to eat in relative silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something calming about Emma's presence, something that made Jane feel like she wasn't just a person sitting alone in the cafeteria, but someone worth sitting with. It wasn't the first time Jane had been invited to sit with someone, but it felt different this time. Emma wasn't just doing it out of pity or obligation. She was genuinely interested in being around Jane. And as the lunch period wore on, Jane couldn't help but notice the way Emma casually engaged with the people around them, greeting other students with friendly waves and smiles. She wasn't a loner, not by any means. And yet, she had chosen to sit with Jane, someone who, by all accounts, should have been invisible. It was perplexing, but in the best way possible. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Emma stood up, gathering her things. "Well," she said, "I guess I'll see you around. You're in my science class, right?" Jane nodded, still feeling a bit overwhelmed by the kindness Emma had shown her. "Yeah, I am." "Good. Well, don't be a stranger," Emma said with a wink before she turned and made her way toward the exit. For the first time that day, Jane felt a flicker of hope. She had survived lunch, and more than that, she had made an unexpected connection with someone who didn't see her as different, as an outsider, or as a target. In Emma's eyes, Jane was just another person, worthy of friendship and kindness. As Jane made her way to her next class, she found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. Maybe it was just a fluke, she thought. Maybe Emma was just being nice because it was the right thing to do. But even if that was true, it didn't matter. What mattered was that for once, someone had chosen her. For once, someone had seen beyond the surface. And for the first time in a long time, Jane felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe she wouldn't have to face every day alone. Maybe, this time, she had found a person who understood her, someone who wouldn't let her slip through the cracks. Little did she know, this was only the beginning, a spark of change. The days that followed felt like a delicate shift, an unexpected change in the air that Jane could almost taste. At first, she wasn't sure how to categorize the feeling. It wasn't exactly hope. It was more like a whisper, a quiet possibility that things could be different, if only just for a moment. The kind of moment that could alter everything, even if it didn't seem like much on the surface. Emma's presence became a steady thread woven through the fabric of Jane's daily routine. Every morning, as Jane stepped into the school hallway, she would glance around, half expecting to see Emma leaning against her locker, waiting to greet her with a friendly smile or a quick joke. And every time, she would find her, just as she expected, standing in the same spot with a casual ease that made Jane feel like she belonged in this world. A world that had once seemed too big, too indifferent to notice her. But it wasn't just Emma's company that Jane grew to cherish. It was the way Emma made the world around her seem softer, more approachable. There were no mocking glances, no sneers, no harsh words spoken behind her back. Emma was a bridge, a connection between Jane and the world she had once been too afraid to navigate. One day, as the final bell of the day rang, signaling the end of classes, Emma caught up with Jane just outside the school's main doors. Her usual casual confidence was there, but there was something different in her eyes. A glint of mischief, as though she had a plan. "Hey," Emma said, her voice light but laced with excitement. "Do you have any plans after school? Because I was thinking, what do you say we skip the bus ride home and go on an adventure?" The words hit Jane like a bolt of lightning. Skip the bus ride. An adventure. The thought had never crossed her mind. She wasn't the kind of person who skipped school, who defied rules or did anything remotely out of the ordinary. That was for other people, people who knew how to live life without worrying about the consequences. But Emma made the impossible sound like something worth trying. Jane hesitated, her mind racing through 1,000 reasons why she shouldn't go. She wasn't prepared for this kind of spontaneity. Her mother would probably freak out as she found out she had wandered off after school. The idea of doing something that wasn't in the plan, something completely unpredictable, was terrifying. But the thing was, a part of her wanted to say yes. That part of her that had always longed for something more than the monotony of daily life, more than the safe, predictable routine that had kept her locked in a box for so long. Before she could talk herself out of it, Emma spoke again, her voice playful. "Come on, Jane. It'll be fun. We'll just grab a smoothie or something. No pressure, I promise." It took every ounce of courage Jane had, but in that moment, she found herself saying something she hadn't said in a long time. "Okay, let's do it." Emma's grin widened, and for the first time in a long while, Jane felt the kind of rush that only came from stepping outside her comfort zone. They both turned and walked out of the school gates, their footsteps quickening with each passing moment, as though the world was opening up around them, urging them to leave the rules behind. As they made their way down the sidewalk, Emma led the way with a confident stride, her voice filling the air with easy laughter and casual conversation. Jane had always been the quiet one, the observer in the background. But somehow, with Emma, she found herself talking more than she ever thought she could. She found herself laughing at silly jokes, exchanging stories about their favorite music, and even admitting how much she hated the school cafeteria food. They stopped at a local smoothie bar, a small, brightly colored shop tucked between two storefronts. Emma ordered first, her usual confidence on full display as she bantered with the barista, a teenage boy who clearly knew her by name. Jane stood off to the side, trying to blend into the background, but Emma wouldn't let her. "Come on, Jane," she called over her shoulder. "What do you want? Don't be shy. I'm buying." For a moment, Jane froze, her mind still caught in the mindset of being an outsider, of not taking up space. But then, something clicked. She wasn't invisible here. She wasn't just the new girl sitting quietly in the corner. Emma had made her a part of the story. She was included, seen, valued. Jane said, gathering her courage, "I'll take a strawberry banana smoothie, please." Emma flashed a bright smile. Perfect choice. They paid for their drinks, and Emma found a small table near the window where they could sit and chat. The shop was cozy, the kind of place that felt intimate without being overwhelming. Jane sipped her smoothie, the cooled sweetness of the drink offering a welcome distraction from the nerves that still fluttered in her stomach. For the first time in ages, Jane felt like she could breathe without the weight of judgment or the constant hum of insecurity that had always followed her. The world outside seemed to fade as she and Emma talked about everything and nothing all at once. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like the natural rhythm of an old friendship, even though Jane knew they had only just started this chapter. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Jane realized something. She was no longer just the quiet girl in the background. She was someone who had taken a chance, who had chosen to step out of her shell and embrace something new. The world wasn't as terrifying as it once seemed. Maybe it was because she had Emma by her side, or maybe it was because she was beginning to believe that she was worthy of moments like this. As they finished their drinks and stood to leave, Emma gave her a playful nudge. "See, that wasn't so bad, was it?" Jane smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her face. "No," she admitted, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "It wasn't bad at all." And as they walked back toward the school, side by side, the future seemed a little less daunting. In that one moment, in that one decision, Jane had taken the first step toward something bigger, something better. And she had done it not alone, but with Emma, the friend who had sparked this change, who had reminded Jane that life didn't have to be lived in the shadows. Sometimes, all it took was one small spark to ignite the possibility of something extraordinary. For the first time in a long time, Jane felt the flicker of something powerful, a sense of belonging. And it was only just beginning. Unveiling the past. The days after their impromptu adventure seemed to glow with a new intensity. Jane wasn't just walking through the motions anymore. She was living. Each morning, when she saw Emma waiting by the door, a thrill surged through her. There was no longer any hesitation, no second guessing. The girl who had once felt invisible in a sea of faces had transformed. Now, she moved through the world like she had something to prove, not to anyone else, but to herself. It was strange how quickly things had changed. Just a few weeks ago, she couldn't imagine being the person who would skip school or break the rules. But with Emma, things felt different. Every boundary she thought she had, every limitation she placed on herself, felt like something she could push against. It wasn't about being reckless. It was about being free. Free from the constant weight of expectations, free from the unspoken rules that had defined her life up until then. But as Jane grew more confident, something began to bubble under the surface, a quiet question she couldn't ignore. Why had Emma, someone so effortlessly social and self-assured, chosen her? Of all the people in school, why had she taken such an interest in Jane, a girl who seemed so ordinary and out of place? It wasn't that Jane didn't appreciate Emma's friendship. Far from it. She had never felt more seen, more important. But the doubt lingered, like an unwelcome guest at the back of her mind. Could it be that Emma was just bored? Or maybe she was doing this out of pity? The thought gnawed at Jane, and she began to pull back, just a little. One afternoon, as they walked out of the school together, Jane couldn't hold the question back any longer. "Emma," she started, her voice tentative. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Emma said brightly, turning to face her. "What's up?" Jane hesitated. "Why me? I mean, out of everyone, why have you been hanging out with me?" Emma blinked, and for a moment, the confident mask she usually wore faltered, replaced by something that looked almost surprised. But then she grinned, the expression warm and genuine. "Because I like you, Jane," she said simply. "You're kind, you're funny, and you don't try to be something you're not. Besides, who else would I hang out with? The rest of these people are either pretending to be something they're not or stuck in their little cliques. I don't have time for that." Jane's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She had known, deep down, that Emma wasn't the kind of person to hang out with someone out of obligation. Still, hearing those words, hearing Emma's unwavering honesty, sent a wave of warmth through her, a sense of validation that Jane hadn't realized she craved so much. But it wasn't just Emma's answer that had changed things. It was the way Jane began to see herself in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, she didn't see the shy, uncertain girl she had always been. She saw someone who was strong, someone who had a quiet power, a resilience that had only just begun to show. The following day, Jane made a decision. She wasn't just going to go along with the flow of things anymore. She was going to start making things happen. It was time to take the next step, to embrace her own strength in the face of the doubts that still lingered in the corners of her mind. The truth was, she didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of it. As the school week progressed, Jane became more active in her own life. She joined a couple of clubs, participated in group discussions, and even volunteered to organize a school event. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but for Jane, it was monumental. She was carving out space for herself in a world that had once felt too big to navigate. Each small victory fueled her confidence, and soon she realized she wasn't just gaining new experiences, she was finding her voice. But with that newfound confidence came a realization, a truth that hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't the only one going through a transformation. As Jane took on more and more responsibilities, as she opened herself up to new people and experiences, Emma, too, was changing in subtle but undeniable ways. One day during lunch, as they sat on the steps outside the school, Emma grew quiet. It wasn't like her at all. Emma was usually the life of the conversation, the one with an endless stream of stories and jokes to share. But today, she was distant, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though lost in thought. Jane noticed the change immediately. "Hey, what's going on?" she asked, her voice concerned. "You okay?" Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, then finally turned to Jane, her expression serious. "You know," Emma said softly, "I've been thinking about something lately. About why I'm always so upbeat, so confident. It's like I have this armor, this mask that I wear every day, and I don't even know why anymore." Jane blinked, unsure of where this conversation was going. "What do you mean?" Emma gave a small, wry smile. "I guess I've been trying to convince myself that I'm okay, that I have everything together, that I don't need anyone. But the truth is, I've been hiding from a lot of things. From my past, from who I really am. I've been pretending for so long that I've lost track of what's real." The weight of Emma's words sank into Jane like a stone. She had always seen Emma as this pillar of strength, this person who had it all figured out. But now, in this vulnerable moment, Emma seemed just as human, just as flawed as anyone else. Jane wasn't sure what to say at first, but after a few moments of silence, she placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, offering a small but genuine smile. "Whatever it is, you don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "You've got me. You've always had me." Emma's eyes softened, the barrier she had so carefully constructed around herself starting to crumble. "Thanks, Jane. I needed to hear that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about the laughter or the fun times they had shared. It was about trust, about the kind of friendship that could withstand the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Together, they had started to peel back the layers, to confront the things that had held them both captive in their own ways. As they sat there, side by side, with the cool breeze rustling the leaves above them, Jane realized something profound. They weren't just friends anymore. They were allies, two people learning, growing, and healing together. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the weight of their fears would resurface. But in each other, they had found something stronger than mere companionship. They had found a way to be real. And that was the most powerful thing of all. The turning point. The weeks continued to flow, each one carrying with it new layers of discovery, and Jane felt herself growing in ways she hadn't anticipated. But as she blossomed, a storm was brewing on the horizon, an inevitable shift that neither she nor Emma could see coming. Despite all the progress Jane had made, the past still clung to her, like a shadow that refused to fade. It wasn't the kind of thing she often thought about, but it was there, lurking in quiet moments. The fear that she didn't really belong. The nagging feeling that she had only gotten this far because of Emma's kindness, or maybe because of Emma's pity. Deep down, Jane struggled with the idea that her friendship with Emma might be built on something fragile, the kind of thing that could crumble if tested. And then, one Friday afternoon, that test arrived. It started with a message, an innocent enough text from Emma, inviting Jane to a party at one of their classmates' houses. It wasn't an unusual request. Emma was always being invited to these gatherings, and Jane had tagged along to a few of them, though always as the quiet observer. This time, however, there was something different about it, something unspoken, something that Jane couldn't shake off. She had never been one for parties. Crowds, loud music, and small talk were always a bit overwhelming. But the invitation felt like a challenge. Was she finally ready to take the plunge? The more she thought about it, the more the idea gnawed at her. What would it feel like to be a part of something, truly? To not stand on the sidelines, but to step into the center of things. To be seen as someone worth inviting, worth celebrating. But as Jane sat on her bed that afternoon, scrolling through the details of the event, something began to feel off. She couldn't put her finger on it at first, but the more she looked at the list of names and the faces she recognized from school, the more she felt like an outsider. They were all people she had seen in the hallways, the ones who always seemed to have their own group, their own inside jokes. The ones who never really noticed her. Emma, of course, was a natural. She was always the center of attention, always surrounded by a group of people laughing and chatting. Jane couldn't help but wonder if that was where Emma truly felt at home, with them, not with her. And that feeling, the feeling of being on the outside looking in, struck Jane like a cold slap in the face. The doubt grew as the day wore on, until it consumed her. Maybe it was better to just stay home, to avoid the potential rejection, to keep herself safe. But then, as the evening approached, a single thought shattered the self-imposed boundary she had spent so long building. She couldn't run away anymore. Not from the party, and not from herself. It was this realization that drove her to act. Without thinking, Jane grabbed her phone and sent a message to Emma. "I'm in. I'll meet you there." The moment she sent the message, a wave of panic hit her, and for a second, she regretted it. Was she really prepared for this? Was she really ready to walk into a room full of people who didn't know her, who hadn't really bothered to look her way before? But there was no turning back now. As she got ready, Jane chose her clothes carefully. She knew it didn't matter to anyone else, but to her this felt important. She wanted to feel confident, to feel like she belonged, even if it was just for one night. She opted for a simple black dress, something that made her feel comfortable, but also a little daring. A touch of makeup and a spritz of perfume, and she was ready. When she arrived at the party, the music pulsed through her body, and the energy of the crowd hit her like a wave. It wasn't anything Jane had expected. The chaos, the laughter, the way everyone seemed so at ease. It was all so different from what she was used to. But she wasn't a stranger here. Not anymore. She had taken the step that would change everything. She was here, she was present, and that alone made her feel like she was finally part of something. And then she saw Emma. Emma was already surrounded by a small crowd, laughing and chatting like she owned the room. Her natural charisma seemed to radiate, pulling people into her orbit. Jane felt a pang of insecurity, the old feeling creeping in. But Emma's eyes lit up when she saw Jane enter, and in that moment, everything else faded away. It was like she had been waiting for Jane, like she had known, in some way, that this was the moment Jane had been building toward. "Jane, you made it," Emma exclaimed, rushing over to her with an excited grin. She pulled Jane into a quick hug. "I'm so glad you're here. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." Jane hesitated, but only for a moment. She was here. She was a part of this. As the night went on, Jane found herself talking to people she had never expected to connect with. She laughed at jokes she didn't understand, danced to music she usually found too loud, and for the first time, she didn't feel out of place. But it wasn't just the party that had changed. It was Jane herself. She wasn't hiding behind her old fears or insecurities anymore. She was walking through the world with her head held high, embracing every moment, no matter how uncertain. But even in the middle of all the fun, there was still a quiet voice in the back of her mind, the one that wondered if things were really changing, if this newfound confidence would last. And then, as the night wore on, it happened. That moment of clarity. One of the most popular girls in school, Lily, approached Jane with a smile. Jane had always seen her from a distance, admired her effortless beauty and confidence, but never imagined she would actually speak to her. "Hey Jane," Lily said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to say, I've been watching you lately. You're different. I mean, in a good way. You've really come into your own." The words hit Jane like a shockwave. Different, in a good way. The thought lingered in her mind, spinning, until she realized something. She wasn't the same person who had stepped into this party that evening. She wasn't the same person who had been afraid of not belonging. She had already carved out a place for herself. She had already shown the world, and herself, that she was more than the shy, unsure girl she used to be. And at that moment, surrounded by people who had once overlooked her, Jane realized that the biggest victory of all wasn't about proving herself to anyone else. It was about finally believing in her own worth. As the music played on, and the night continued to unfold, Jane knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done growing yet. This was only the beginning. The world was wide open, and she was ready to take it on. The unseen victory. In the weeks that followed, Jane began to see life through an entirely new lens. The girl who had once cowered in the shadows, unsure of her place, now stood tall in the light of her own strength. But what was most surprising was that, with every new door she opened, she realized that the true power didn't lie in the approval of others, but in the quiet confidence she was building within herself. The small victories that had once seemed impossible were now the very things she woke up to every day. She'd become a regular at school events, a voice in discussions, a familiar face in the crowds. No longer was she the girl who hesitated to speak up, who shied away from interaction. She had learned to embrace who she was, flaws and all, and the people around her were starting to notice. But as Jane had learned early on, true transformation was never a straight path, and there were still moments of doubt, moments when the past seemed like it might swallow her whole. One afternoon, Emma asked Jane to meet her at a local park after school. It had been one of those days where the skies were particularly heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Jane could feel something was different, though she couldn't place it yet. The air was thick with change, and as she walked to the park, her mind raced with the possibilities of what was coming. When Jane arrived, Emma was sitting on a bench, her posture a little more rigid than usual. There was a tension in her expression that Jane hadn't seen before. As she approached, Emma stood up, her eyes meeting Jane's with a certain vulnerability that was new for her. Emma had always been the one with the answers, the one who seemed to have everything figured out. But now she seemed uncertain. "Hey Jane," Emma began, her voice softer than usual. "I need to talk to you about something." Jane felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. She had become so used to the new rhythm of their friendship, so used to the ease that came with Emma's support, that this sudden shift felt like an unspoken warning. But she didn't retreat. She stood firm, her newfound strength grounding her. "Of course. What's up?" Emma hesitated, and for a long moment her gaze fell to the ground. When she spoke again, her words came slowly, carefully, as though each one was weighed with a quiet gravity. "I think I've been taking you for granted," Emma admitted, her voice laced with regret. "And I don't mean to. But I've noticed something about myself lately, something that I didn't want to see. I've been so focused on my own stuff, on my own life, that I didn't realize how much I've been leaning on you. Like I've been using our friendship to distract myself from, well, other things." Jane could feel her heart race, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected this, not in a million years. Emma, the girl who had been her rock, who had been so steadfast in her belief in Jane, now seemed uncertain, almost fragile. And that made Jane's stomach twist with confusion. "You've been there for me, Jane, more than anyone," Emma continued, her voice wavering. "And I think I've relied on that too much. I haven't let you be your own person. And I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put that on you." The weight of Emma's words hung heavily between them, and Jane could feel the familiar rush of emotion that she used to shy away from. But instead of retreating into her old insecurities, she stood her ground, ready to face whatever came next. This was her moment, just as much hers as it was Emma's. "Emma, I get it," Jane said, her voice steady, the words flowing more easily than she expected. "I've been there for you, but you've also been there for me, in ways I didn't even realize. You've been part of what helped me find myself again. I couldn't have done this without you, but I also can't be the person you need me to be all the time. I need to be me." Emma looked up, her eyes glistening with something that could have been tears, but there was no sadness there, only a quiet understanding. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm proud of you, Jane. You've come so far. You've become someone I didn't expect. Someone stronger, more incredible than I ever imagined. And I think that's what scared me." Jane blinked, the realization hitting her all at once. Emma wasn't afraid of losing her, but of losing the version of Jane that had always needed her. But now, Emma was seeing the woman Jane was becoming, and that terrified her because it meant letting go of the familiar, of the old dynamic that had always kept them close. It meant letting Jane be more than just a sidekick, more than just someone who lived in her shadow. But in that moment, standing before Emma, Jane realized something profound. She didn't need Emma's validation anymore to feel worthy. She had already found her place in the world. And though Emma's words were a shock, they were the final piece of the puzzle Jane had been assembling for months. She had learned that growth wasn't just about gaining confidence. It was also about letting go of what you thought you needed and embracing who you truly were. "Emma, I'm still here for you," Jane said, her voice calm but full of conviction. "But we're both allowed to grow. We're both allowed to change. We don't have to be the same people we were last year, last month, even last week. We're allowed to be our own selves. And that doesn't mean I'm leaving you behind." Emma's smile, hesitant at first, slowly blossomed into something genuine. A look of relief and acceptance passed between them, and it felt like the weight of years of uncertainty had been lifted. "I'm not going anywhere," Emma replied softly. "I guess we're both figuring this out together." And so, the two friends sat on that bench, in the quiet of the park, no longer needing to speak to understand one another. They had crossed a threshold, a place where their friendship no longer relied on their shared insecurities, but on the deep, unspoken understanding that each of them was capable of standing on their own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Jane realized that the journey she had been on wasn't just about finding her place in the world. It was about discovering that she could stand tall, even when the world around her seemed unsure. She wasn't just Jane anymore. She was the woman who had fought for herself, who had grown in ways she had never thought possible. And as the night stretched on, she knew, deep within her, that this was just the beginning. The victory wasn't just in the changes she had made. It was in the woman she had become. The woman who was finally ready to claim her life, her story, and her future, and nothing would ever hold her back again.